There was a time on Earth when you could walk across the ocean floor and feel something slimy, alive and sticky beneath your feet. They weren't plants, they weren't animals. It was a global carpet of bacteria producing slime. This disgusting mat sustained an entire ecosystem for 100 million years until everything collapsed catastrophically. This is the story of the bacterial slime empire. And today we're going to dive into this bizarre chapter of evolution where life decided to build civilizations on sticky goo. The inhabitants of this world were absolutely bizarre. They looked like drawings made by someone who had never seen an animal before. No recognizable eyes, no mouths that make sense. Some didn't even have an identifiable front or back. Kimberella was one of the few that made some anatomical sense. Oval, slug-like shape, a few centimeters long. One end probably housed a mouth with a scraping tongue. We know this because we found fossils alongside scratches on the mat's surface, scraping marks going back and forth repeatedly. It was actively eating the bacterial film, making it one of the first documented grazers. Dickinsonia is probably the celebrity of this period. It looked like an oval-ribbed pancake lying on the seafloor. Some tiny, with just a few centimeters, others exceeding a meter in length, gigantic for something without a skeleton. For decades, scientists debated its identity. Plant, fungus, alien, fat molecules preserved in a fossil solved the mystery. It was definitely an animal, but that doesn't diminish the confusion. No identifiable head, no obvious organs. It probably moved by expanding and contracting its body to slide across the mat, scraping bacteria as it went. Charnia was radically different. It looked like a fern or feather stuck vertically in the seafloor. It had a central stem with branching structures extending laterally in a fractal pattern. It grew more than half a meter tall. It lived anchored to the mat by a holdfast disc, and it just sat there. Zero movement. The best scientific guess is that it absorbed dissolved nutrients from the water through its surface. Charnia and its relatives dominated deep water environments where sunlight didn't penetrate. This means they definitely didn't photosynthesize. They were just sitting in total darkness, absorbing whatever nutrients floated by. Tribrochidium is geometrically incorrect. It sat on the seafloor like a small disc with 3 spiral arms emerging from the center. Not 2, not 4, 3. Nothing alive today has triple symmetry. It's mathematically bizarre. Around the end of the Ediacaran, skeletons began to appear. Cludina was a tiny tube-building organism that secreted a hard calcium carbonate shell. Multiple individuals would cluster together and cement their tubes to each other, building the first reefs ever made by animals. And here comes the crucial part. Some Cludina fossils display holes drilled through the shells. They're clean round holes that completely penetrate the tube wall. This is direct evidence of predation. Something was attacking Cludina, drilling through the shell to reach the soft animal inside. This is the first documented proof of a predator-prey relationship. The peaceful garden was beginning to crack. But how did this strange world emerge? Let's go back 635 million years. Earth had just emerged from the most catastrophic global freeze ever recorded. The entire planet had turned into an iceborne. Oceans frozen solid, glaciers covering all continents. Most life simply died. The survivors hid in tiny pockets near volcanic hydrothermal vents. But then something changed dramatically. The ice began to melt, glaciers retreated massively, and suddenly there were oceans again. The planet went from frozen desert to tropical greenhouse, probably in a geologically short period, and the oceans weren't just wet, they were chemically transformed. Oxygen began to accumulate in the water in unprecedented quantities. Oxygen matters tremendously because it's metabolic fuel. You need it to build large bodies and actually move around doing things. Meanwhile, the continents were moving tectonically. The ancient supercontinent Rodinia was fragmenting. This created many more coastlines and shallow seas, perfect habitats for life to thrive. And then, a giant meteor struck the planet about 580 million years ago. The Acraman impact. Locally, it was absolutely disastrous, but life continued. At this point, the stage was completely set. Warm oceans, plenty of available oxygen, shallow seas, an environment finally stable enough for life to try bold experiments. And what happened wasn't a dramatic explosion of fish or reptiles. It was bacteria. An absurdly stupid amount of bacteria covering absolutely everything available. The material on the seafloor wasn't random mess. It was highly organized. Microbial mats, extensive blankets of bacteria and algae, all stuck together. In the Ediacaran period, these mats were literally everywhere. The entire ocean floor, in shallow areas, was completely covered. They grew dense and cohesive, sometimes several centimeters thick. The bacteria on top photosynthesized during the day, producing oxygen. Those below digested dead material. It was a complete ecosystem, functioning in layers. How do we know these mats existed? The rocks from this period have peculiar textures. Geologists call them elephant skin textures. The rock surface becomes wrinkled and wavy in a very specific pattern that only forms when microbial mats dry out or are suddenly buried. You see these textures in Ediacaran rocks around the world. The mats could spread so widely because absolutely nothing stopped them. In modern oceans, mats are constantly destroyed. Snails scrape them, worms dig through them, fish poke and tear them. But in the Ediacaran, none of that existed yet. 0 snails, 0 worms, 0 fish. The mats grew completely undisturbed. This created something crucial. The sticky slime glued sediment particles together firmly. It made the ocean floor firm and stable. The mats also became an abundant food source. They were packed with bacteria, meaning concentrated nutrients. Organic material just sat there waiting to be consumed. And because the mats were everywhere, food was everywhere. You didn't need to hunt or actively search. You just existed on this infinite buffet. But the mats did another absolutely fundamental thing. They preserved corpses perfectly. When something died on a microbial mat, the bacteria kept growing and sort of sealed over the body. The slime filled in minute anatomical details. If sediment suddenly buried it, you got a perfect impression. Paleontologists call this the death mask hypothesis. This is why we have abundant fossils of soft things from the Ediacaran, but almost nowhere else in the rock record. So you had the entire seafloor as a stable, firm surface, covered with abundant food that also perfectly preserved whatever lived on it. From a bacterial perspective, this is absolute paradise. They took over completely. For consecutive millions of years, nothing could touch the mats. The reason is strangely simple. Nothing had evolved yet to fight them. There were no efficient grazers, burrowers, animals that could excavate sediment. The things that would normally keep bacterial mats under control simply didn't exist yet. Food chains were ridiculously simple. At the base, you had the mats producing organic material. Then you had organisms that absorbed nutrients from the mats directly or filtered particles from the water. That's it. No predators actively hunting prey. No complex food webs. Just a bunch of filter feeders and grazers sitting passively on the slime. It sounds incredibly boring, and it probably was, but it worked perfectly. The system was stable for tens of millions of uninterrupted years. Stable meant that life could focus on experimenting with new body plans without constantly worrying about survival. There was no evolutionary pressure to develop weapons, armor, or speed. Just grow big, spread out, and passively absorb nutrients. And the Ediacaran oceans finally provided enough oxygen, combined with unlimited food from the mats and zero predation. You had perfect conditions for life to get weird and big without negative consequences. The mats weren't just habitat, they were the entire absolute infrastructure of the ecosystem. Remove the mats and everything else collapses instantly. They were the ground, the food source, the habitat, and the fossil preservative, all simultaneously. And every organism that evolved during this time was shaped by this reality. They were slime creatures, whether they wanted to be or not. Around 541 million years ago, everything went catastrophically wrong. The Ediacaran biota had thrived for almost 100 million years. This could have continued indefinitely, but it stopped brutally. And when it collapsed, it happened fast enough that the fossil record shows a before and after, without much between them. The problem started with evolutionary innovation. New types of organisms were evolving, and these had a completely different approach to life. They weren't content to sit on the mat and passively filter food. They wanted to actively move, dig, drill into the sediment. And this seems like a minor change superficially, but it completely destroyed the foundation of the Ediacaran world. Burrowing animals were the worst thing that could have happened to the mats. When something burrows, it violently mixes sediment. It churns the top layer with the bottom layer. And microbial mats absolutely cannot handle this. They need a firm surface to grow properly. Once sediment is being constantly mixed, the mats can't establish themselves. They're mechanically torn apart. Geologists call this the Cambrian substrate revolution. Before it, the seafloor was mat floor, firm and stable. After it, the floor was mixed ground, loose and constantly churned. And this change happened in just a few million years. In the early Cambrian, sediments are packed with intertwined tunnels. Worms and worm-shaped things were frantically digging everywhere. The mats were being systematically shredded. And once the mats were gone, everything that depended on them was in severe trouble. The fronds needed the mats as a firm anchor point. Without them, there was nowhere to attach. The grazers needed the mats as food. Without them, there was nothing nutritious to eat. The entire ecosystem was built on bacterial slime, and the foundation crumbled like a house of cards. But burrowers weren't the only problem. Grazers were improving dramatically too. Early Ediacaran grazers had gently scraped the surface. But later, grazers were much more aggressive. Between the burrowers churning from below and grazers attacking from above, the mats had no chance of survival. And then predators appeared in massive numbers. We saw hints of predation at the end of the Ediacaran. But in the Cambrian, predation had become the norm. Everything was hunting or being hunted constantly. Soft-bodied organisms that had spent millions of years doing nothing suddenly had to deal with things actively trying to eat them. Ediacaran creatures had no developed defenses. Dickinsonia was just lying there, flat. You could just walk up and bite. Charnia was permanently stuck in one place. It was free protein, just sitting there, waiting. Natural selection during the Ediacaran had been strangely relaxed. There was no pressure to evolve speed, armor, or weapons because there were no real threats. But as soon as predators appeared, these priorities flipped completely. Now you need to run away quickly, hide, or fight back. And Ediacaran organisms couldn't do any of these things. They were simply easy, static targets. The end result was mass death. Most classic Ediacaran forms simply vanished from the fossil record abruptly. The fronds disappear. The large, flat discs disappear. The quilted creatures disappear. In the early Cambrian fossil assemblages look completely different. Instead of Dickinsonia and Charnia, you have trilobites and early arthropods and things with shells actively moving. Some Ediacaran lineages probably survived by evolving into something completely unrecognizable. But the distinct and bizarre body plans of the Ediacaran were mostly extinct. Nature tried this radical experiment and then moved on. The really dark part is how absurdly fast this all happened geologically. There were 100 million years of uninterrupted stability, and then, within perhaps just 10 million years, the entire system was completely gone. That's incredibly fast in geological time. It's fast enough that organisms couldn't adapt evolutionarily. They simply died and were replaced by animals much better suited to the new violent world. The Ediacaran period isn't just some obscure chapter in Earth's history. It's the origin story of complex life. Everything alive today, including you watching this, traces back to organisms that evolved during or shortly after the Ediacaran. Before this period, life was bacteria, just individual cells floating around for billions of years. The Ediacaran was when multicellular life discovered how to exist at scale, how to build bodies with different tissue types, how to move, how to interact with the environment. The strangeness of Ediacaran organisms shows us something fundamental. Evolution has no blueprint. It just tries things experimentally. The Ediacaran was a period of experimentation when nature tested body plans that were never repeated. Triple symmetry, quilted structures, fractile fronds. None of this survived to today, but it demonstrates how flexible evolution can be when operating in completely open territory. The fact that most Ediacaran creatures went extinct also teaches us something crucial. Success isn't permanent. You can dominate an ecosystem for 100 million years and still be wiped out when conditions change rapidly. The Ediacaran extinction wasn't caused by an asteroid or volcanic eruption. It was caused by new organisms changing the rules of the evolutionary game. If you enjoyed diving into this era where bacterial slime ruled the oceans, subscribe to Extinct Aquaria to explore more bizarre chapters of aquatic evolution. Leave your like, share with other curious minds, and tell me in the comments which extinct era do you want us to unravel next. Until the next dive into the past.